I suppose we're all ready then for the next session. Right. Welcome everyone. This is now let's begin our section on literature. It seems that our first speaker has, I quote, disappeared. I suppose a flight didn't make it and he is not on Zoom. I was going to introduce him, but perhaps next time, next conference, or later when he walks in the door, which I hope he does. Now the second presenter in the situation would be me. In this case, I think I'm the first presenter. And since I am also chairing, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Aynur Rahmanova, and I am a doctoral student at Tallinn University. As you can see, the title is right here, but there's one crucial word missing from it, and that is carnival. It's actually my topic of discussion for today, Vaccinian carnival specifically. Now, you probably know the picture of Vaksin in which he looks very serious. He has long hair and a long beard, but a lot of people don't know that this one also exists somewhere on the web. Now, he is the one on the right. Carnival as a concept first appears in problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. And here it is a literary concept that describes Dostoevsky's characterization. In these two examples, we can see that both of them include some opposites, and that's what exactly makes carnival. Carnival is, you make it by combining two opposite terms into one setting. In the first example, you can see that Alyosha, this one character from the Brothers Karamazov, has some self-contradicting characteristics in his character. So he himself would be this carnival or carnivalesque entity. And for the second example, we see that the novel includes two characters who have very opposite tendencies. Myshkin is considered bright and joyful. He comprises this carnival paradise in the novel, whereas in contrast, Nastasia Filipovna is gloomy, infernal, and Bakhtin calls on her to represent the carnival hell. Now, because Myshkin is one extreme and Nastasia Filipovna is another extreme, the novel itself in which both these two characters appear would be the carnivalesque entity, or else the drawing room in which these two characters interact. Right now, you can probably see that there's a little bit of a contradiction in here. So carnival is supposed to be quite revolutionary at the time because it tells you a more realistic way to show the world in which people are very messy. People are not cleanly structured into single concepts. But then you don't see this contradiction in the characters of the idiots, according to Vaksin, right? Why is Myshkin nothing but a joyful, positive, paradise-like character, whereas Nastasia Filipovna is the complete opposite? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and I think it's a bit reductive to say these characters are nothing but static values, but unfortunately, these are his only two examples, and he doesn't explain more. Now, later on, he abandons Dostoevsky pretty much, and carnival becomes a concept to describe society, to describe transgression. Now, this is pretty loose. It usually describes one liminal event, one rather Denising event with the following characteristics, rather loosely related. A breaking point in time usually refers to when carnival takes place as a feast, to mark the end of the seasons, to mark something happening, to mark a new world of change and renewal. And one way to mark it is by feasting. Feasting also celebrates the body and all the senses rather than the mind. It's something very physical, very sensual. It's about eating and it's also about sex. Related to this is the concept of the grotesque. And in Carnival, in Bakhtin, he mentions that the grotesque is, it pushes the body beyond its physical limits. It makes the body expand, let's say, from overeating. It makes the body combine with other bodies. And this is a metaphor for the cultural body as well, in which different discourses, different people combine in this one feast setting to make a combination body, a grotesque in the positive sense of a cultural body. This is also related to the abolishing of hierarchies. So you see in this piece, this very grotesque entities, lots of people from different social classes who normally wouldn't interact are all brought together into this one setting. Everything is mixed up, and then you have something completely new. Also in the setting, what is allowed is eccentric behavior. This refers to his main inspiration behind Carnival, which is a medieval festival, the Feast of Fools. This is when people from different classes, especially the higher and the lower classes, switch roles for a day. So you would have the priest washing clothes, and then common illiterate people pretending to preach, pretending to give speeches and sermons. It was all done in good fun. And according to Bakhtin, the point of the Feast of Fools and Carnival in general was to celebrate the defeats of power, of earthly kings, of the earthly upper classes, of all that oppresses and restricts. This doesn't only go for authorities, earthly authorities, but then also supernatural ones that we might fear, like let's say death or sickness. Carnival is a time to celebrate everything that we would normally be afraid of. Started the right time, yes. So now we're left with two versions of Carnival. We have a literary version. Oh, well, if you can see right here, I'll try to move it. And then we have, well, this festival that I have just outlined in the previous slide. Some people have a little bit of a problem with this. They think that Bakhtin contradicts himself when he talks about Carnival sometimes as in literature and Carnival and other times in culture. And some scholars from the West go as far as to say that, well, the literature version of Carnival is a bit more real. It's the true version. The other one is the false one. I think they missed an opportunity here because this Carnival as a festival is more well known. It's more applied, especially in Western scholarship of Carnival. So one very simple solution. Let's have two carnivals and give them different names. We have Carnival Polyphony and Carnival Subversion. Carnival of Polyphony refers to well, the study of Dostoevsky's novel. It's a companion to the famous concept of polyphony. Oh, I should probably mention everything I outline in green is a term that I coined for this particular article of mine, or two. So both of these carnivals are revolutionary in different ways. They both do something different. In Carnival Polyphony, what you have is you combine two opposites together into something new, and this contradiction in one entity is supposed to make it more powerful. So the example he gives, Alyosha is more realistic of a character than, let's say, some flat personification of a virtue from a medieval morality play, or in the other case, Mushkin, but he doesn't address this contradiction. Carnival Subversion, the one we're going to talk about today mostly, it can be a lot of things really, but if you really, if you just narrow it down to its final structure and nothing but it's a bare bones structure, it's rebellion. It's a model of rebellion. And how does it work? It reverses the hierarchies we see in everyday life and in Western metaphysics. The main opposites that Bakhtin deals with in his study of carnival submersion are the following. We have church and marketplace. That's just a different way to say center and periphery, or dominant discourse, which is the church, and the peripheral discourses, which is supposed to overcome the church in the Feast of Fools. Related to this is folk laughter versus official seriousness. And then the third one here, I could have probably explained it more delicately, but what I was trying to say is that he privileges the body and the world of the senses over the world of the mind. So there you go. Now, carnival subversion isn't exactly just well accepted by all scholars across the field or in different fields. And there are some main arguments. Usually they're made in passing as parts of case studies, but then I try to gather them together into these clusters. So Terry Eagleton mentioned something that a lot of people have repeated in various different ways to various extents, is that carnival reduces people to their bodies It may celebrate their bodies, but it goes too far to say that people are nothing but bodies rather than citizens. And also, unauthorized transgression is not exactly a transgression. You would never ask someone for your freedom. You would fight for it. Freedom and liberation is something to be taken away, not to be asked for with permission. So many authors, here I can basically refer to, there's a book called Carnivalizing Difference. And there's one section about carnival and classical comedy, and pretty much all the authors in this section take it for granted that the classical comedies, like the ones of Aristophanes or Juvenal, they're not meant to be subversive at all. They're meant to be modes of social control. And Bakhtin doesn't mention that, and he doesn't take that into account. In fact, he thinks that all of these things, these classical comedies, are transgressive. So a lot of people think that carnival, it's just a pressure release, too much oppression, too much authority in everyday life, and the pressure needs to go somewhere before we have a full-on revolution. But then the most polemical and interesting argument, it's a very, very short article with a citation of Wikipedia for some reason, where Scully says that carnival turns people into a mob. Now that's the marketplace, that's the grotesque version of culture you glorify so much. It's nothing but a mob. Everyone is forced to participate. You cannot just choose not to be part of this mob. And it is therefore totalitarian. Now, one critic isn't mentioned much. I only found one note of this in a footnote, but Umberto Eco. He has written one short essay against carnival, and he has written a novel pretty much against carnival as well. And his point is that carnival is not something for the peripheries of culture. Carnival is a mechanism for the dominant discourse to control the peripheries, because how can you break a rule without knowing it? Every time a rule is broken, it is reinforced. You have to know what the rule is, and there has to be a rule to break. Excuse me for one moment. I think I have lost my notes a little bit. I recently submitted an article for Eco's case against carnival. His main argument is that carnival is not an act of rebellion initiated by the cultural periphery, but rather an authoritarian act from the dominant discourse. Now, Bakhtin is the one claiming that carnival is a very subversive structure. And the problems that all the critics have is that carnival can be deconstructed. So if you pretty much combine every single one of carnival's critiques, you can see that there is some kind of deconstructive potential in all of them. So binary oppositions are nothing new to us. We know how they work. We know that they are always power relations, and one term dominates over the other historically. You have the Augustan one, you have the Cartesian one, and of course, Foucault has against reason and madness is pretty much the same, one of presence and absence. And traditionally, the cultural dominant is privileged over the cultural peripheries. Now, a carnivalesque binary pretty much just inverts the order of domination and calls that rebellion and calls that subversion. So in these examples, you would simply privilege absence or the body or other madness and be done with it. The main one is privileging the cultural periphery over the cultural dominant. Well, following Derrida maybe a little bit anachronistically, we know that this action of reversal is simply not enough. It's impossible to talk about one extreme without depending on and referencing the other. And I mean, I believe Derrida's argument in Cogito in the History of Madness is that madness is a product of reason. It's always in the discourse of reason. Without reason, you cannot even have a concept of madness. We can say the same about the cultural periphery and the cultural dominant. Who's to say the cultural periphery is one unified discourse? That's a different kind of grotesque, isn't it? So let's just take Bakhtin out of the picture for a moment. Let's just say that what if this deconstruction of carnival is not accidental? What if it's not a flaw? What if it's all built into the structure? In that case, carnival would be a double-faced structure. It's too easy just to deconstruct it. I did it in my master's thesis, and I think it's time to go a step further. So Carnival has a public face, a false one. This is the face that pretends to celebrate the cultural peripheries and the grotesque body and says that this suggests growth and possibility. But then if you look at the other side, the grotesque is the celebration or the emphasis of a unified cultural periphery. It's a structure that combines incongruous discourses so that none can express themselves on their own terms. All dissenting voices, all possibility of alterity now become one part of the dominant discourse, and all they can express is the dominant discourse instead of their own. Now, in the public face, Carnival celebrates eccentric behavior and the transgression of daily norms are all permitted. But then what it actually does is to tell you that transgressing social norms and hierarchies are considered eccentric, unusual, and most of all, temporary. This is Eco's argument here. Carnival sells itself as a rebellion against authority, but it expresses rebellion as a ritual or a game. It's something to anticipate, to expect, but also considered abnormal. It prevents a more damaging dismantling of the dominant discourse. This is the argument from Eagleton and the authors of Carnivalizing Difference that I mentioned earlier, the classicists. And lastly, it pretends to be a celebration of the body, but in fact, it reduces persons and citizens to nothing but bodies. We can arguably say that this is the first step of totalitarianism, in which all actions become justifiable. I think this is going quite far, but first we take Eagleton's argument as Wells Groys, and then look at the definition of totalitarianism from Camus and Arendt. Totalitarianism is when everything is permitted, and first of all, you have to reduce people to objects, to nothing but their bodies. So what do we do with this extremely cynical but subtle structure? Deconstruction is not an accident. Essentially, what happens in Carnival is that the dominant discourse creates a periphery of its own and sells it as rebellion. Repressive regimes know that its citizens dream of rebellion, and Carnival is essentially the response here. It's not a flawed and unusable model of rebellion. It's actually a very usable model of reinforced authority. Carnival acknowledges our rebellious intentions and then performs a classic bait and switch, is the double-faced function. It ensures that our skepticism towards authority leads to nothing but more and stronger authority. And in this way, we can say it is the ultimate structure of betrayal. It's not all so terrible and cynical, though, because if we know how it works, if we see its value not as something unusable, but something that perfectly describes a trick that is very difficult to catch, then perhaps we can stay ahead a step from anyone who tries to take our dream of rebellion and betray it somehow. We have to be ready to look at the world from another perspective and to turn the upside down itself upside down if needed. Thank you for your time. And for your patience. Right. Yes, please. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm not really trying to make a combination of everybody together, but rather see how people have tried to attack Carnival from different ways. It's quite funny because these attacks are not exactly very large works. They're not monographs or anything, but very short ones. One of them is even a footnote. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mhm. Oh, bring forth something new, as in his famous image of pregnant death. Mhm. Mhm. Yes. Yes. Mhm. I understand. Yes. I don't. Mhm. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. Mhm. I will try to address your first point first, because you made it first, and the second point second. The first point is that I understand what Maxine is trying to say, that carnival is also, it expresses rebirth. But then if you see what is actually being reborn, according to Echo's argument, what's being reborn is not something new at all, but then the same old discourse that was dead the following day. So you kill some church rituals by making fun of them. And then the next day we return to life in all its seriousness. We take those rituals seriously again. The authorities only pretend to die. This death is not real at all, and nothing new is reborn, but what's reborn is the old. He also has an example of medieval monsters that they are combinations of different things, right? Someone with well, let's say the head of a snail, but then the one large foot instead of two, the scapegoats. The thing is that these are also not new. They are combinations of things that we find familiar. If we see someone who looks exactly like a person, but except for, having one leg and one giant foot instead of two legs like we do, we don't see this as someone new. We see this as a distortion, a wrong version of what we recognize. And that's the problem I have with the image of pregnant death and rebirth, is that what's reborn is not anything new. Carnival does not generate things that are completely new. Yes, there is death, there is rebirth, but that's the trick, right? It tells us something that it isn't. And then on the second point, excuse me, let me try to think about how to respond to the second point, is that yes, there are different levels of carnival, but there are different descriptions, and that's why the term has been used to describe pretty much anything, really. You can use carnival however you want, because it's a very loose and sometimes vague concept. But what ties it all together is reversals and rebellion at its heart, as well as the double-faced aspects. The connection to the mob is that you say carnival is life, but then he doesn't go beyond that. Can you explain? Can Baksin explain further? What does he mean by life exactly? If you gather all the people together into one marketplace to feast, to shout, to tell them that they're free, are they really free if you give them only one day to do so, and if one authority has to give them that permission? And then also, what does he mean by liberation and social equality just because we gather everyone together? The same hierarchy is returned the following day. Nothing is changed. So I wish he would clarify what he meant by carnival being life or carnival being this half-acted, half-played mode. I understand his imagery, and then I try to summarize the imagery myself, but the thing is, his promises don't work out. The images are supposed to mean something, but they don't mean what he would like them to mean. I hope this answers your question to some extent. Yes. Okay.
It seems to me that carnival then in general tools for of the dominant structure of the dominant structure to the peace and then continue their power to the peripheral structure.
Yes.
So, yeah. People who look and so on. Then that if from the functional point of view, then carnival expansion is a function, very, very important function for the dominant structure to continue and to renew their power, to renew their human power to the whole society.
Yes.
It's the place. But because in your paper you said about deconstruction.
Deconstruction. I'm so sorry. I thought you said reconstruction.
Deconstruction.
Place for
yeah, because you didn't explain in detail about your idea about deconstruction, but what I have in my mind is deconstruction is about deconstruct the structure of the domain.
Oh yes, that's the thing. You see, I think a lot of the critics already know that carnival can be deconstructed, that in the celebration of the periphery, what you see is a celebration of the dominant discourse. So you deconstruct it, but it's a little bit too simple for that. I think that with carnival, what happens is that you have a dominant discourse that deconstructs itself into, well, carnival. This is essentially exactly what happens if a dominant discourse would like to deconstruct itself before you get to it.
Yeah, so it was deconstruct in order to make new construct.
For making new construction, I don't think it actually can work with this reflective system. But for instance, I think Lotman's Semiosphere would be a much better model for creating something new, a new culture, because instead of having one dominant discourse and everything else being in the peripheral discourses too, you have different dialects, so that the dominant discourse becomes nothing more than just another dialect. Then you don't have mirror images of two things. Then you have many things. It's more asymmetrical that way.
There is something in chat. I don't know whether it's a question, otherwise I will go ahead.
Okay, I'm trying to find my mouse.
Yeah. Well, this is a good transition because I was going to say almost the same. And thank you for this interesting presentation. I'm not really specialized in the concept of carnival, but I find it very interesting the way you analyze and the way that you go further. If you could go back to the double-faced structures, I was wondering whether this is your analysis or you base it on someone else's. Well, I found it interesting, this mirror presentation. It's your analysis?
Yes, this is something I'm doing for my doctoral work.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting to see what it is meant to represent and what it really represents, so this meta level. And I have a question, but it is out of curiosity. At some point, there was something in orange, and you said that the green terms are yours, but what about the orange one?
I wanted it to change color to show.
It was supposed to be green.
No, not green. It wasn't supposed to be orange in any case. I just wanted to show that this is the carnival we're going to focus on, since there are two carnivals. Thank you. And thank you everyone for your attention. There we go. Now let's move on to our next speaker, Professor Jurgita Katkuvienė. Yes. Oh, okay. Well. Yes. Okay. So now let's have our third speaker. Please welcome Aušra Kundrotaitė, a doctoral student here at Vilnius University. She will speak about architecture and spatiality of the literary text, represented through a case study. Please welcome.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I see everyone very far, but well, I hope you can hear me. And first of all, I would like to thank everyone, organizers and all the presenters, for very interesting and thought-provoking first day. My relation to semiotics is not a very straightforward one, and I touch upon semiotic issues mostly by way of other theories, namely theories of intermediality, and this I think will be evident from my presentation. So let's get on with it, and let me share my screen. 1 second. I'm sorry, 1 second. Okay. Is it visible now? My slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to briefly present my case study today, an autobiographical work in prose, Mabre Hotel, Mabre viešbutis, written by renowned Lithuanian city poetess Jurgita Katkuvienė. The book came out 8 years after Vaičiūnaitė's death, and most of the texts gathered in the book have been published previously. Thus, the significance of the edition rests not so much on the content of the main corpus as on the publisher's strategy of its presentation. Paratext of the book was provided by poetess's daughter, Ula Vaičiūnaitė, who, it is interesting and I think important to note, is a professional book illustrator and book cover designer. Paratext in question appears as a curious collection of heterogeneous fragments, family album photos, facsimiles of poems and drawings, and 2 facsimiles of a manuscript plan of a work never finished, but curiously enough bearing the same name as the published book, Mabre viešbutis. We can see here in the slide, Mabre viešbutis, Mabre Hotel, and also on the other facsimile of a manuscript plan here. And here we see some other fragments, the facsimile of a poem, and some drawings, and a photo of Jurgita Katkuvienė. Secondly, I would like to quickly discuss hypertextual relations in the text. Most of you are probably familiar with Gerard Genet's theory of hypertextuality, so I won't discuss it in a great detail. Just a quick reminder of a few aspects most relevant to my presentation. The theory of hypertextuality highlights the palimpsestis nature of text. And here I quote Gerald Prince, any text is a hypertext, grafting itself onto the hypotext, and merely a text that it imitates or transforms. Any writing is rewriting, and literature is always in the second degree, end of quote. So on the one hand, hypertextuality can be seen as an aspect of all textuality in general. For example, even different drafts of the same text that would not have any intertextual relations whatsoever could be considered as instances of a process of hypertextuality, which in this case would be called autohypertextuality. On the other hand, hypertextuality can be seen as a theory dealing with certain generic categories, such as, for example, pastiche, caricature, parody, travesty, and so on, which involves a certain dialogue, namely imitation or transformation between different texts. Jeanette distinguishes three main types of hypertext: an allographic hypertext, an autographic hypertext, and a hypertext with an implicit hypotext. I will not, you can see brief descriptions in the slide. I will not read them. I will mainly concentrate on the third type. Why? Because I consider Mabre to be primarily such a type of a hypertext. So hypertext with an implicit hypotext is such a hypertext which structure includes a previous literal hypotext and which becomes a paraphrase or a periphrasis of this hypotext. Paraphrase, as you all know, is a rewording of something. What is the hypotext of Mabre Hotel, and how does this rewording in this particular case actually happen? As was already mentioned in the introduction, most of the texts gathered in the book have been published previously. Editorial notes at the end of the volume include a bibliography of the pieces published. From this list, we learn that most of the essays come from the book In the Childhood's Mirror, Vaikystės veidrodį, that the cover you see on the left side. Published in 1996, while the author was still alive. 5 more texts come from various periodicals, and only 2 texts are being published for the very first time. So what is the purpose of this new edition? If we compare In the Childhood's Mirror and Mabre Hotel, the most striking difference, of course, is the rich visual paratext of the latter that was provided by the poetess's daughter. From editorial notes, we also learned that after publishing In the Childhood's Mirror, Vaičiūnaitė was planning to continue this autobiographical project. The next book had to be called Mabre Hotel, and this we also saw in the manuscript plan reproduced in the published book, and it had to be illustrated with photographs of people mentioned in the text. Although the book published in 2009 is called Mabre Hotel and it includes photos of people mentioned in the text, it can hardly be considered a truly new work, or at least not the one that was being planned by the author. What is new is not the autobiographical content by the author, but the author's daughter's attempt to render the unfinished autobiographical project visible. Poetess's daughter, Ula Vaičiūnaitė, can be legitimately called the co-author of this new intermediate artifact, of this hypertext, which hypotext itself appears palimpsestis. That is, the hypotext of the published version of Mabre Hotel is not merely the previous autobiographical text In the Childhood's Mirror, but the unfinished manuscript plan, which is itself an autographic hypertext with an autonomous hypotext, namely the book In the Childhood's Mirror. And I tried to illustrate, for it to be more clear, this hypertextual relation in the slide. But the manuscript plan is the main hypotext is suggested also by the covers of Mabre Hotel, imitating pages of the manuscript. Here on the right side, you can see it imitates not a printed text, but like some notebook. Now, why do I go in so much trouble making all these hard to follow distinctions between these different layers? Well, because in this case, there is a difference that makes a difference. It is important to highlight the role of the poetess's daughter, Ula Vaičiūnaitė, because the paratext that she provided is much more than just a blind attempt to fulfill the will of the dead author. The published version of Mabre Hotel is not just a peculiar quest for the work never written, but also an authentic and heartfelt dialogue with the deceased mother, which in the process of reading is actualized as a dialogue between the text and the paratext. Mabre Hotel is not simply an autobiographical account by Jurgita Vaičiūnaitė, but more importantly, her daughter's attempt to remember, which in turn becomes an invitation to remember, and which makes Mabre Hotel an interesting case of literary memorialization. By employing paratextual and by way of paratext, hypertextual strategies that actualize an unwritten autobiographical project, the book as an artifact paradoxically associates the memory and commemoration of Jurgita Vaičiūnaitė with a feeling of fracture, of emptiness, of non-existence. Such a paradoxical memorial is by necessity interactive, one that presupposes a subject who feels and remembers, who actualizes or realizes emptiness, and who eventually fills it with a unique reading experience. In the case of Mabre Hotel, where the reader is invited to follow in the footsteps of the author of the paratext, Ula Vaičiūnaitė, the reading experience is necessarily intermedial and intermodal, and involves crossing various boundaries, for example, between the text and the paratext, which in this case also means between the word and the image, because as you saw, the main corpus is mainly written text, and the paratext is mainly images. The paraphrasing of the implicit hypotext, which we find in Mabre Hotel as a hypertext, is actually not so much a rewarding as we could say re-imaging. So now I would like to give you 3 brief but telling examples of this so-called re-imaging process, which have varying degrees of autonomy and which range from mere illustration to creative and even in a way provocative reimagining, that is initiating new ways of looking at a written text. So for examples, first one, a straightforward illustration. So this would be, and there are a lot of those photos, but I just put a couple in a slide. This would be photos of people or things mentioned in the text. Then would be what I call a creative illustration. And this would be photos reflecting structural relation between characters. For example, in the written text, sisters Jurgita and Dalia are often presented as a kind of doubles of each other, connected not just by simple repetition, but also by reverse mirror-like reflection. And a couple of photos of Jurgita and Dalia presented in the book, the ones that you also see in the slide, are especially helpful in highlighting this, if I may say, dialectical ideologic mirroring relations. So you can see that in both photos, the sisters are dressed very similarly, and in the text, many times it is mentioned that the parents used to dress them as twins, though they are not twins. Also this repetition, which we straight away recognize that they are dressed in very similar fashion, is kind of counterbalanced by that they have a different complexion, and this also is mentioned in the text. So Dalia on the left side, she is blonde, and Jurgita is dark-haired. And this opposition, light versus dark, again is counterbalanced in same photos by some visual details. So for example, in the photo on the left, fair-haired Dalia is wearing dark sandals, and Jurgita on the right side, she has dark hair and she is wearing white sandals. And in the other photo on the right, they are already older. They have also here in similar style, but opposite colors. But again, they have very similar bags, and the bag of dark-haired Jurgita, the inside of the bag is white, and the sisters inside of a bag is black. And this both photos shows this kind of mirroring dialogical relation between the sisters, and helps to recognize it also in the text. And a third example would be a provocative or stimulating illustration. And this would be Jurgita's drawing. You see it on the left side bottom. So Jurgita's drawing, which is a fragment of Madame Vigée Lebrun autoportrait with her daughter, copied from a catalog of Louvre paintings. The fragment depicts only the head of Madame Vigée Lebrun. The other crucial figure of the painting, the artist's daughter, affectionately hugging her mother's neck, is conspicuously missing. Instead, in the right top corner, right here, of the drawing, we can see a childish writing which reads, "My mom used to draw," mano mama paišė, and a date. And so we realized that this writing was done by Ula Vaičiūnaitė, and it was inscribed on the drawing more than 3 decades prior to the publication of the book. So instead of an iconic image of an affectionate daughter of Madame Virgilia Brun, we have a childish handwriting of the daughter of Jurgita Katkuvienė, which affectionately comments on her mother's artistic endeavors. Such a shift, firstly, highlights an iconic nature of the handwritten words in question, which actually primarily would be regarded as symbolic and indexical signs. Secondly, it accentuates the indexicality of an iconic image. That is, the importance of the copy of the head of Madame Virgilia Brun appears to lie not in the likeness to the original painting, but in the contiguity with the poetess's hand, testifying for the authenticity of the autobiographical discourse. And thirdly, the overall picture, the overall drawing, combining the drawing by Jurgita Vaičiūnaitė and the writing by her daughter Ula Vaičiūnaitė, starts to function as a mirror-like reflection of and a visual commentary about the overall project of Mabre Hotel, its published version. So all these metamorphoses of science that we see when we move from one representation to the other, that is from the intertext, to the original painting, to the drawing by Jurgita with the inscription of Ula's handwriting, and even more importantly, the metamorphosis of the interpretation of science that we experience when we look at one and the same picture. That is, when first we see, for example, writing as a symbolic, and then by way of intertext, we realize, we notice, or we are invited to notice its iconic nature. So all these metamorphoses become a representation of the formal strategies of Mabre Hotel and a peculiar instruction for the reader of the book as an interactive memorial, as it was defined previously. Now, there are many ways to consider intermediate relations, but in the light of the example that I just presented, it seems that in this case, the most suitable would be such a theory of intermediality that not only considers relations between traditionally different signs and media, but also highlights the mixed nature of each and every sign or media. In other words, one that is based on a Peircean dynamic notion of a sign. One example of such a theory would be Lars Ellestrom's consideration of intermediality as intermodality. I will not discuss Ellestrom's theory, and I will not go into more detailed analysis of intermediate relations in Mabre Hotel. What I would like to stress is that analysis of intermediate relations in the context of Peircean semiotics necessarily puts great emphasis on the particular context of semiosis and consequentially on interpreting mind. Therefore, the role of the reader becomes central. Also, it is important to note that this reader is by definition an embodied reader, one that relies on different senses in determining the sign and in establishing diverse intermediate connections. Now, where does it leave us in relation to autobiographical writing as traditionally author-oriented discourse? Unfortunately, there is no time to present a detailed analysis of Philippe Lejeun's concept of the autobiographical pact. But still nearing the end of my presentation, I would like to share some observations about the autobiographical pact of Mabre Hotel, and in particular, and a hypothesis about the nature of the autobiographical pact in general. One of the main components, or I would say the main component of the autobiographical pact as formulated by Lejeune, is the author's name appearing in the text and on the cover of the book, establishing the identity between the author, the protagonist, and the character, and connecting the world in the text with the space of the paratext, and by way of it, with other extratextual contexts. I think it is legitimate to say that the idea of the autobiographical pact seeks to divert attention from exclusively textual details, for example, the position of the narrator, and to link the designation of the autobiographical to the intermediate space of the paratext, namely to the information on the covers or in the prefaces, and to various conventions of publishing. This being said, it is interesting to note that nevertheless, when the idea of the autobiographical pact is being reconsidered, it is usually done in combination with linguistic and narratological observations. So I would like to draw your attention to the possibility of reconsidering the idea of the autobiographical pact in relation to more reader-oriented intertextual and intermedial approaches. And I think that the case of Mabre Hotel is more than a suitable occasion. So the genre of Mabre Hotel is defined as memoirs, and the name on the cover of the book matches the name of the protagonist in the text. So the basic requirements for the autobiographical pact are fulfilled. Still, when we consider hypertextual relations actualized by paratextual strategies of the book, we see that there is an important shift in authorship, which cannot be ignored. As was noted previously, the author of the paratext, Ula Vaičiūnaitė, can be legitimately called the co-author of the overall project, the published version of Mabre Hotel, as an intermediate artifact. In fact, since the autobiographical pact as defined by Lejeune is primarily a paratextual affair, so in Mabre Hotel, it appears as mainly second parties, that is the poetess's daughter's creation. Moreover, it is possible to claim that actually it is a certain autobiographical pact that is the main subject of Mabre Hotel and the main reason for its publication. Lacking new original autobiographical content by Jurgita Vaičiūnaitė, Mabre Hotel appears as a sort of autobiographical space par excellence, more specifically as a hollow spatial figure of the author's name, as a sort of hologram formed, of course, not by interference of light beams from the laser, but by diverse intertextual and intermedial relations. In the case of Mabre Hotel, firstly, highlights the role of the reader in establishing the text as autobiographical. Secondly, it suggests a mode of interpretation. More specifically, it points to the legitimacy or even necessity of intertextual and intermedial approaches when dealing with autobiographical discourses. And last but not least, it brings to the fore the peculiar spatiality of the autobiographical discourse, namely the distinctive nature of the author's name as a sort of overarching palimpsestus and multisensual that is involving various senses, architectural construction. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing the screen. 1 second.
Do I have any questions? Oh, yes, please. Yes.
Thank you, Aušra, for your presentation.
Thank you.
I would like to ask some simple question. You called this picture with the head of mother without a daughter. You called to this position as provocative and stimulating. Yes.
Yes.
But don't you think that all other tricks, as manuscript and other photographs, they are also provocative and stimulative?
Yes.
Why you divide it so, or why you call it provocative?
I mean, I just wanted to give that's not exhaustive. Yes, I just wanted to give an example of, I think there are 3 types of how text and images interact, and this I gave those names like which are also relative, straightforward, creative, and provocative. But yeah, it's not exhaustive. I mean, I just gave that example, you know, to give an idea of what I mean, but there is definitely more, and maybe I didn't notice still or didn't formulate all of them, but definitely there is more, and I think that those reproduced manuscripts, you know, that way sort of suggest that a book is, you know, a continuation, a book after the book in the childhood's mirror. And so you firstly, when you see those manuscripts, that's what you expect. But then when you read, and then you read the tutorial notes, you see that this is all just, it's not like that, that there is no new, it's not a continuation. It's a kind of, there is kind of emptiness in there. Yes, that continuation is missing. And so there is all this play that the paratext initiates. So definitely, I think that especially those manuscript plans, they are very provocative and important. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. My question follows up just the previous one, because the term that struck me is the creative. I was wondering could you account for the choice of this term? Why do you call them creative?
Again, this was it's quite relatively straightforward, creative, provocative, just a kind of name that I came up, but creative, I mean, because it's not just illustrating, you know, the most the first layer, that is, if it would be just a photo of the person or a photo of the thing that is mentioned in the text, but it's creative because it touches on a bit deeper, it illustrates some structure that is deeper a bit, that is not so just visible, you know, in a plain sight. Kind of, you have to really a bit analyze the text to see that structural relation, and then you notice that it is also illustrated in the photos, or maybe even photos. Maybe you can notice first in the photos, and then it helps you to see it in the text. So creative because it's not so straightforward. It involves more of a play, let's say, with the structure of the text.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you that there is a relation that is represented in these photos. So I was wondering whether you have considered using Persian categories. For example, when I have a look at this photo, for me it's a diagrammatic index, because the relationship is the diagram for Perse. So I was wondering whether going into Persian terms, you wouldn't come up with more specific categories for your pictures. But I think the idea of differentiating them is really interesting. But maybe, yeah, you could think of different terms to make them more precise. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for your point, because yeah, these were these names were just like for the conference, but for my thesis I will use more Persian, you know, diagrammatic icon look and icon metaphor and so on, and then probably will be some more precise names can be chosen for this illustrating.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
That was interesting. Thanks.
Yes, please. We have one more question. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. We don't seem to have questions. So thank you very much, Aušra. Now,
thank you.
It seems like well, you don't need to have the floor anymore, so it's good to take a break.
Okay.
Our final speaker for this session, and then perhaps this evening, is Professor Jurgita Katkuvienė with a presentation on semiotic approaches to visual poetry, exploring meaning-making mechanisms in poetry without words. Please welcome.
Thank you. I know that it's a last presentation, it's some kind of challenge this evening, the last one. So, but I hope we'll overcome this challenge with the poetry. And if you are too tired, please just enjoy poetry and don't listen to semiotic analysis. The traditional and worn-out definition of poetry is that poetry is the art of the words. Or as Joseph Brodsky said, being the supreme form of human talk, poetry is not only the most concise, but also the shortest way to communicate the human experience. And we can agree with that. And such is the common understanding of the poetry related to the content conveyed as in a certain way by language or by words. In a certain way, I mean by some artistic means. However, saying poetry is the art of the words in the context of this poem, that's Lithuanian author, obtains yet another meaning. Here, poetry appears as the art of arranging words in a certain way. That is, arranging the real elements of language that relate not so much to the semantics of the words, which is the domain of the language, as to the materiality of the words, which is also the domain of the language. Visual composition, or here also colors, creates the meaning of the poem. The words function as the material of this meaningful set, creating not so much semantic or conceptual as central or perceptive space of meaning. Such kind of poetry, which relies on an arrangement of linguistic elements in which the typographical and other visual effects are more important in conveying the meaning than verbal significance, is called, as you know, visual or concrete poetry. Such kind of poetry not only changes the concept of poetry itself and questions the concept of language, but also raises methodological challenges for semiotic literary analysis. On the one hand, the traditional semiotic concept of Helmslavian original suits quite well the analysis of visual poetry text, which argues that the text is meaningful whole, which consists of a cohesion of a plane of content and a plane of expression. That means that every significant set, everything which means something, contains a content and an expression. In other words, what is said and how it is said. Content is related to more conceptual sphere of ideas, and the level of expression is related to sensual experience and structures taken by senses. Greimas defines the poetry, but the poetry in the sense poeticism, I'm not sure if it's correct translation in English. So he defines the poetry in the sense of poeticism as the correlation of two, of content and expression. Here we can point out that such a semiotic approach would stress as not the duality of the nature of visual poetry, verbal and visual text, but the general structure of the meaning of the text that manifests itself as a whole. On the other hand, traditional Greimasian semiotics has the tools to analyze poetic discourses in semantic terms, that is, in content plane. However, they are not sufficient for the literary works such as visual poetry, which has brought new forms in which visuality is important, necessary, dominant, and in some cases, even the only component in generating the meaning of a poetic text. As we know, in the beginning, Greimas settles that the theory should ignore the text expression plane to lay exclusively on the content plane. Nevertheless, later, his interest in the field of senses or perception unlocked the new interest for semiotics, the plane of expression, which is received by the senses and has its own strategy of meaning production. As we know, sensual, or in our case, visual features of the text are analyzed by visual or plastic semiotics, which mostly focuses on visual texts such as pictures, photographs, advertisements, fashion, etc. In semiotic studies of poetry, the plane of expression is not avoided, but usually analyzed on the basis of a connection between the content and expression of verbal discourse. For example, by looking at the content, expression, isomorphism, or some plastic manifestation in the content plane. The case of visual poetry raises questions. What kind of signification is produced in poetry the verbal text is minimized or even absent, and which is experienced through the senses as an immanent object. How are such texts or forms conveyed to the reader in terms of the understanding or definition of a poetry? I will look into the strategies of meaning production employed in Lithuanian visual poetry of the 21st century, especially in two cases, in two texts. And I will look how the senses and perception work in this kind of discourse. A poem by one of the famous contemporary Lithuanian poet, Gytis Norvilas, consists of two parts: a verbal part, traditionally understood as a title, and a graphic part, a square of 9 horizontal arranged parallel lines. The first look that recognizes plastic formats is immediately here taken over by the look of culture knowledge or culture recognition, for which the text consists of two linguistic parts, Lithuanian and Arabic. Even without knowing the language, this reading eye recognizes Latin and Arabic characters. The culturally engaged look knows that each verbal text always has its own audio, or in our cases, visual expression, which immediately is figurativizated. I'm not sure if it's English good translation, figurativizated, as a figure of a certain language. Reading the poem in a traditional way, once we recognize the figurativeness of a certain language, for example, Lithuanian script for me becomes a figure of Lithuanian language, which I know. We automatically absorbed those black or colored incised graphic formations and activated the content they present. It is obvious that visuality is present in reading any poetry, but it is as though desemanticized by actualizing and emphasizing the semantics of the content. Thus, knowing Lithuanian, I read the first part of the poem in a traditional way as a verbal text, which has its own meaning. But in the second case, in the second part, I read it by scanning the graphic expression. There, the signifier is graphic characters, and the signified is Arabic language as such. A script as a figure of language, in this case, as a recognition of a figure of Arabic language, depends on the competence of cultural knowledge. We recognize Arabic without knowing the language. Or, for example, I don't know Arabic language. If we know the language, we see that it is an imitation of Arabic script. Here, an Arabic character functions as a graphic onomatopoeia. So the character is not a given or natural thing of language. It can be a graphic deception based on the theme of imaginary Arabism. Thus, the characters as graphic elements does not guarantee the meaningful language. I'm sorry, meaningful language. It could be simulacrum of language. This second part of the poem can be read using the tools of visual semiotics as a meaningful formation institution in itself. For example, there is no clear direction how to read it. Arabic language seems to imply right to left reading. However, the arrangement of the 9 horizontal parallels justifies a different direction of reading, from left to right. On the left side, all horizontal lines start from the same position. That is, a vertical line connects their starting points. Starting position. The edge lines of the right-hand side horizontals are unevenly distributed. It means that on the left, they are united by uniformity, and on the right by contrast. Thus, the space is divided into an area created by 9 parallel horizontal lines, each of them a syntagm of graphically arranged minimal units of expression, lines, dashes, hooks, dots, and their configurations. Some units or their group in the syntagmas are repeated, creating even a chaotic but a certain rhythm. In the fourth line or on the right, Latin characters, ATA, are inserted between the Arabic characters, and in eighth line, and the eighth line ends in a sequence of dots or of even distribution. Yeah, I will only mention that in Lithuanian, ATA phonetically is similar to the farewell words ate, and graphically it reminds of a funeral inscription ATA, which means rest in peace or rest eternal. A sequence of dots as a transform punctuation mark of suspension points indicates something that was interrupted or incomplete. So in both cases, we have the semantics of an end or interruption. The left-hand edge of 9 horizontal, which begins with a single large and secluded dot, correlates in reverse with the sequence of these dots of the 8th line. And here we can see some oppositions, for example, in the last line, like stress and flow, or assertion and continuity, and it's in reverse with the 8th line. So we have the form of a square with an uneven right-hand edge consisting of 9 parallel horizontal lines of equal size but of different lengths that start at the same place and are all connected by the theme of Arabism. Returning to the title of the poem, we read in Lithuanian. In Lithuanian, it is written, 9 dancing Arabs on the battlefield. We can see that the verbal and graphic parts create a mutual reflection, but not an identical one. The content of the first part is graphically expressed in the second part, and vice versa. A square filled with horizontal lines is a battlefield. 9 parallel by different horizontals represents 9 Arabs and trajectories of their lives. Their graphical expression manifests their struggle as a dance, or so on. Reading of this poem involves not only the tools of verbal semiotics, but also the reading strategies of visual semiotics that allow the recognition and description of the effects of meaning captured by visual perception. The mirroring relationship of interdependence between the verbal and the graphic text creates the semantic totality of the text, only it is not clear what is an original and what is a reflection and what a reflection are. I would like only to mention that this structure of this poem reminds me some kind of reduced or reconstructed Baroque emblem. It's such a genre which consists of 3 parts: verbal part, which is called lemma. Second part is a graphic image, and the third part, as you know, is a text. So here is some kind of deformation of such a Baroque emblem. And another example is the work of AWW by Donaldas Apanavičius, one of the most interesting representatives of Lithuanian visual poetry. It's a work. Here we deal with a radical poetic text that is void not only of words, but even more so of letters, recognizable characters. At first glance, it would seem that it has nothing to do with language or with speech. The 22 numbered graphics are connected by equally sized and isolated square areas filled with minimal units of expression, dashes of various tilt angle, ovals, steep lines, and their configuration. It's a fragment. it is interesting to note that these minimal units of expression are not only elements of a graphic or geometric picture, but also a substance of writing. I will quote Greimas, who wrote that writing is a system, as a system is based on opposites of graphic features, sticks, circles, hooks, etc. End of quote. Thus, the plane of expression of a written language is a system of graphic science. The articulation of signified that lies beneath it lends it the status of language. As we saw in the first poem, at the time of reading, it depends what signified we link the signifier with. It can be said that here we have a text written using universal graphical characters. The poem actualizes the level of language expression and questions the substance or matter of the expression itself. Minimal units of the plane of expression function as certain potential repositories that appear in one or another meaning in a specific connection with the content plane. There are no words in the poetic text that would detain the poem in the language prison. However, these graphic features are some kind of rudiments of words or rudiments of letters, of rudiments of characters. But at the same time, sticks, dashes, hooks, circles, etc. are not necessarily graphic features of a language, in particular of a writing. So this means that system of graphic expression itself is not property of language. And I would like to say that in some kind, this graphic features or graphic characters, which we see here, is some kind of universal material for all kind of visual expression. Yes, yes, some kind of universal substance or universal material. In Apanavičius' text on the strategy of production of the meaning is created at the level of expression, that is on visual reading. The numbering of full volume squares indicates the direction of reading and allows to see that a narrative of visual expression is created. I mean that this 22 squares. So we can see by this numbering that a narrative of visual expression is created. A purposeful semantic process created from the composition of minimal units of expression, eidetic contrast, and their variation. For example, here I took the first one and the last one. For example, right title dashes form a full volume area of triangle figure that opposes the full volume form of slashes here in the first one, which in each square is filled with new elements from the neighbor areas. And in that we have this one. Configurations of graphic forms which at first seemed homogeneous, locally established and stable, gradually begin to change, filling their internal contents with foreign elements from the neighboring areas. A dynamic movement that leads from purity to a mixture, from order to a chaos, or from fragmentation and division into merge and unity, connects these 22 squares in one syntagma. The poetics of movement or dynamics is the meaning of this poem. And in the end, I just have to say that 2 days ago, I found out what does the title AWW means. AWW can be encoded as ASCII worldwide. And as you know, ASCII is abbreviated from American Standard Code for Information Interchange. So ASCII is a set of digital codes representing letters, numerals, punctuation, and other symbols used as a standard format in the transfer of text between computers. So here we have some kind of poem about how computer movement communicates and creates a text. Some kind of poetry of creating new, of movement of creation, movement of creation. So that's all for this short presentation.
Thank you. Any questions? There are other questions. My question is a bit deep, so go ahead. I mean, it's not a bit deep, but it's provoking.
You mean typography? No, my.
Sorry, would you just summarize the question so that people on Zoom can hear? Because I think.
So the question was, is that typography can be as an element of poetry? Linguistic element. Okay. I say so? No, I didn't say. No, I said that I just have to say that I said that, okay, an arrangement of linguistic elements in which the typographical effects is important and is called visual or concrete poetry. So it's the definition of concrete poetry. It's not my definition. I just take it. But my problem was to rethink this definition using the poetry of the 21st century, because it's definition taken from the 20th century. So it's not my definition. Yeah. Yes, so it's a question. Colors is an element of poetry here also. It's my question, how you can say that it's not a domain of language? If it's a poetry. Yes? Domain of poetry, yes. So I say visual composition and color creates a meaning of poems, so not of language. Yes. Okay, maybe, okay. And one more, can you why do you think Yeah, it's true.
language.
Just phonetically, I have such feeling of interpretation. Mhm. It can be. I just propose two interpretations, which I found out now, which I was thinking, and the reason why I think that it could be so, or we can see some kind of phonetic similarities. It's because ate, it means the end. It's connected semantically with bye. So that's why I connect with this end.
Yes, but this message just neglects.
Why?
It's writing, it's imitation of writing,
Mhm.
and you can't pronounce it because it's not language, it's just graphic figure.
Yeah, but that's a point that when I know Latin letters, I began to read, and I read ate. It's different reading with Arabic letters because I don't know Arabic, and I only know that for me it's some Arabic letters. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to grasp this how to say, this position. Then you began to differentiate how you began to create a signification. For me, ate, it's immediately I connected it with, as you said, with audio. I connected it immediately, ate, even if I'm even if I'm reading it, not pronouncing. Do you understand?
Yeah. I think the discussion is
Yeah.
really interesting because for me, poetics, and especially if it's visual poetics, it's open to interpretation. And so that's why, for example, you perceive it like that, but maybe some other people would perceive it in a different way. But the fact that the author doesn't write the words clearly what he means, it means that he gives open place for interpretation. So I don't know whether you said it. And so I have several questions. First, thank you very much because I didn't know visual poetry. Now I discovered this. Would you say that visual poetry goes so beyond the languages and is universal in a way, as opposed to traditional?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think as I analyze now visual poetry, it's a huge poetry. So, but I have a hypothesis that the main problem and the main theme of visual poetry in general is a theme of language itself. It's always about language limits, about language possibilities, about language expression. And that's how you can separate visual poetry from, for example, pictures, because visual poetry, okay, it's only hypothesis, but I have such feeling, and till now, which I read, is always about language. It's like some kind a domain of language or problematics of language. Here also, I try to show that these two texts, they are dealing with some sphere where the language begins, for example, or the writing begins, or some kind, or how we can understand one or another written character. So, but it's only a hypothesis. I'm not sure.
I'm happy you mentioned language because another question I have, but I don't have the answer because I'm questioning myself. At what point we can say that it is no longer poetry? For example, you said that it's language, so the first examples I can see that it's poetry, but the last one,
Yeah.
I have doubts, and I'm wondering at what, because for example, when I read poetry, it makes me imagine, read, but this one doesn't, but maybe it's just personal. So do you think we could succeeding, like getting the definition even a lot
That's a very good question, and this question which in every session somebody asked why it's not poetry, or why it's not a picture, or why it's not a graphic thing. So my answer is the same till now, is the same, because it's dealing with language problem. It's dealing with some kind of signification of it or meaning of it. It's one on another aspect of a language. So I will answer.
I think
Of what? Of, yeah, but interpretation of what? Yeah, but
if there is some logic.
yeah, if there is some logic, it's the main. Yeah. Yeah, it should be. Yes, of course. Of course, the main thing is here an opposition between Latin characters and some kind of Arabic characters. I think the main opposition. Yeah. No, of course, it's only a fragment of analysis. It's only
You cannot read Arab script myself. So there isn't sound hidden. There isn't sound hidden in this imitation.
In Arabic,
Well, there is in this imitation. Dance, for example, then the question arises.
Yeah. I don't know. Till now, I don't know. I have to analyze more. The one thing is that it's not Arabic, but it's really some very similar characters. So it's only one thing. But I need to think more, because, for example, here you see it's the similar sequences. So it means some stable or continuation of one line. And here we can see that they are similar. They are repeating. Yes. So I need to make more analysis on this even plastic level. On this plastic level. Exactly. Plastic? So it's Grimasian term. Yeah, with features which you grasp with sensual or perceptively, with senses. They call it. So plastic semiotics, they are dealing with such kind of features.
Interesting, because perhaps the plastic level or the plastic sign is very much related to typography.
There are any questions in the chat? You all just stop sharing the screen. I think so bad.
No, I think it's. I think it's enough. We can finish with poetry. Thank you.
Thank you for the very, very interesting presentation. Stimulating. I'm wondering if the first line of this 9 hours reads like, oh. So you've shown me to someone who speaks Arabic.
No, I asked a poet
Yeah.
what you do. So he said, he just played with it.
Well, this
But of course, I have to ask some questions. Yeah, exactly. You are right. I was thinking about it.
well, this concludes our session on literature. It's fascinating presentations. Thank you everyone for your wonderful questions too, as well as your presentations. And now let's, including you Zoom folks, let's go drink some coffee and eat some lentil pies.
And then go to the General Assembly.
Yes.